Welcome back to Baltimore Birdwatchers. I'm Nikhil Mehta. With me, as always, is Daniel Rotter. We're so excited to bring this podcast back for the 2025 MLB season. And really, even though the season has technically started, for me at least, it doesn't feel like baseball is around the corner the way it is. I'll be at the Orioles opening day game in a couple of weeks, and it doesn't quite feel like we're that close to baseball. But Daniel, you just came back from Sarasota, a little trip down to spring training. Do you feel differently? Did that kind of rejuvenate you for the season?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be back, Nikhil. While I was just there, as a fan, obviously, I did it from more of the fan experience side. I had never been, and I gotta say, if you're an Orioles fan considering it, it was a really, really nice time. The stadium there is a good venue. It does remind me of Camden Yards in some ways. And I would also, what I did when I was there is I structured it around a weekend where the Orioles would also be playing the Pirates in Bradenton. And I gotta say, Pirate City in Bradenton might be even nicer than Ed Smith Stadium. Like it's a great, great venue they have there. They have like a whole outfield tiki bar and stuff. So I would definitely recommend setting your trip up around that. But as far as baseball season for me, like I've been pretty locked in for a while. I've been writing a lot about the Orioles for justbaseball.com, as you can see on my hat here. But while Nikhil's kind of been locked onto the Russell Street Report Ravens side of thing for a lot of the winter. I've been putting out a lot of pieces on the Orioles. I've been doing a lot of fantasy baseball draft research as well. So it's not too surprising it's right around the corner for me because this offseason, you know, I've been pretty, engaged with the news and covering what's going on in the sport for a while. So I'm really excited that we get to see the guys back out on the field.
So when you were down in spring training, obviously, I know you didn't get to see the whole series of games, but were there any prospects or players that stood out to you that aren't getting as much hype?
I know he's starting to get some hype now, but when we acquired Livan Soto from the Reds, it was kind of just like, oh, this is like a nothing move. He really has performed quite well in spring training, though, and while he is definitely still just organizational depth, I mean, we saw him out there among starters in one of the games. I think that especially if Gunnar is not ready for opening day, which it seems like he wants to be, but that's not anything certain. I feel pretty confident that Soto would be the guy who steps in as his short-term replacement on the roster. I know there's still not really a place for him with all of these tremendous infielders and stuff. But he seems like someone on the hitting side who, might be a little bit more than we expected. And also on the pitching side, I didn't get to see him while I was there, but Zach Fruit has certainly been getting a lot of buzz as a pitching prospect who's performed well. I honestly didn't know a whole lot about him, but in one of my dynasty leagues in January, we were doing a rookie draft, and somebody took him and led me to do some research on him. And this guy who drafted him actually works in the Diamondbacks player development system. Told me that he really likes what the Orioles are doing developmentally. So I now it's kind of almost not a surprise to me that a guy who works in developmental system on another baseball team wanted to take him in our fantasy league, and now he's performing well.
Yeah, I feel like it's always a good sign. It's like again, I'm still very Ravens brained, but when you see a free agency signing and the fans of the other team are really upset they didn't keep the guy, it's a good sign, but it's even more so when it's coming from inside the organization, like you're talking about. So the Orioles, obviously spring training, I'm not even sure what their spring training record is. Obviously the
Like
record doesn't
500.
matter. Yeah, and I've seen a number of interviews of players who are kind of they all have their different approaches to spring training. Some of the ones who some are trying to get kind of back into the swing of things, so to speak, after the off season. Others are trying out different things and seeing what works and what doesn't. It is very much a testing ground for I would say especially for pitchers in terms of figuring out what their arsenal is going to look like over the course of the season. So a number of prospects I think have gained some buzz. Fruit. Obviously Sam Basallo is like the big name around baseball right now. One of the well, I forget what his ranking is nationally, his prospect ranking is, but I know he's very, very close to the top.
Pretty
Um,
consensus like top 10 by now, I think.
yeah, and he's one of the players I think the Orioles are hoping finds a way to contribute. But we've seen how cautious they are with their development with bringing up young players. And that brings me to kind of the first piece of roster news that we saw come out in the last week, which is that Kobe Mayo is going to start the season down in AAA. I was a little bit surprised by this, given the injury at Gunner and the fact that the the team needs infield depth, but I also think it does kind of speak volumes about where the team sees Mayo defensively. Obviously, Mountcastle and O'Hearn are going to be, on the opening day roster, and if Mayo is a guy that they see as a first base only kind of guy, then it's hard to put him on that roster as well if unless you want O'Hearn playing outfield more often, which is another logjam the Orioles have. What
Yeah,
are
I
your
think
thoughts on? Good.
Yeah, I think his comments that he made were very rightfully true about how this was a lose-lose situation for him, and the way that the Orioles have kind of organizationally set themselves up is a guy like Kobe Mayo is going to be blocked if we don't move a lot of these hitters that we're drafting for pitching. I mean, with our first four draft picks in every single draft since Mike Elias has taken over the management side of things, we drafted one pitcher with all like 24 of those picks. So, it's no surprise that there's suddenly like a top prospect who has nowhere to go. And I mean, it seems unlikely that he's going to be able to provide much defensive versatility. I mean, he's almost built like a pitcher's build. I mean, he's like 6'4". I mean, he's a big dude, and I just find it hard to believe that he's going to be able to play a really quality third base. I mean, it's not to say he's not a good athlete. He's a very good hitter, and I still believe in the bat, even though his brief major league audition didn't go well and spring training wasn't really great for him. But I mean, to be honest, just as someone who's really into the team, I didn't see a path for him to make the team unless we moved on from Mountcastle, and it kind of seems like Mountcastle's the guy in his way. And I think the only way that Mayo gets a consistent role on this team is when Mountcastle gets traded, because I don't see the Orioles management operating on trading a controllable young top prospect. I think they'll trade the older guy who has kind of proven already to be a above average but not a superstar player on a closer to expiring contract.
I agree with that. And I think, we were talking about this right before we started recording. Those kind of moves aren't going to be made anytime soon. Those are moves that are made in June at like the absolute earliest, and more realistically close to the deadline once there are clear buyers and sellers and the Orioles have a better idea of what they need. Although it's fairly evident to me right now that, the Orioles will have needs this season. And it's kind of tough to go into the season knowing like the Orioles are going to need to buy pitching. They're going to be in a position once again where they need to buy pitching. Um, that's just a result of the offseason that they had and the continuing injury concerns that surround this team. I think, Gunnar, like you said, is working hard to be back for opening day. But obviously he wants to play, but the Orioles aren't going to risk his long-term health, his season-long health, just to get him out there opening day. They're fine letting, even putting him on the short-term IL if they need to, which I think is the smart move to handle injuries. And like we've just been saying, there's plenty of depth when it comes to bats, but not the same case when it comes to arms. And that's to me where the injury concerns are a little bit more warranted when you have multiple guys coming off of major injuries last year who aren't even, some of whom aren't even going to be ready for opening day this year. And then you're losing the guy who was really tabbed to be the front of the line starter. And this was supposed to be kind of the takeoff year for him, to use a fan favorite term, in Grayson
Lift
Rodriguez.
off.
Yeah. And then liftoff, right. And then he goes down, and it's not really clear what the long-term prognosis is on him. It sounds like there's still some uncertainty around exactly the nature and severity of his injury, which is obviously concerning. And then you look at the rest of the rotation, and you're like, this doesn't look great. It's going to rely on a lot of offense to be able to win early in the season, and that's, as we know too well with this Orioles team, no matter what the line names in the lineup are, the offense is not a guarantee.
I mean, I think you can feel pretty good about the offense over 162, contributing at a close to, if not elite level. But, certainly as you've been referencing with the pitching, like these are the kind of guys to get you through 162. The only guy who really that we had, it seems like a potential, impact starter in the playoffs is Grayson. And while he still obviously could do that, the prognosis doesn't seem to be like a super long-term injury right now, although I do certainly worry about anything near the elbow. Um, I mean, even with Zach Eflin, like he pitched all right in the playoffs last year, but he doesn't miss a ton of bats. He's really more adept at limiting walks. And so, he's fine to lead the staff again, kind of through these times where our proverbial ace is missing. But certainly going into the playoffs, we're going to want Rodriguez and we're going to want another guy better than Eflin probably if we want to feel good about our chances. Because look, Charlie Morton is going to be a fine regular season pitcher. We hope that Sugano will hold up. I mean, he hasn't pitched, 150 innings ever in his career, I think. And then Dean Kramer, like we know who that is. He'll get you through the regular season, but can't really feel like you can depend on much more than that. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that like I'm really upset that we didn't sign a pitcher because I don't know, there weren't like a ton of seemingly available impact arms. Like, yes, we went after Burns, but Burns didn't really seem to be seriously considering anyone other than the Diamondbacks unless he got a boatload of money. Um, Freed, I mean, like, kind of seemed like the Yankees were all over him once Soto left. And then after that, it was kind of a bunch of guys that, are they really that much better than Zach Eflin? Like, it's hard to say. So I think obviously with our, Hall of hitting prospect and young major leaguer wise, it makes a lot of sense to explore a trade. But, I mean, there were rumors what the Padres were wanting for Cease or King, and they wanted what was honestly an overpay. And at the end of the day, I could see why we said no, and we'll just try and take it into the deadline and stay in playoff contention. And hopefully by then we'll make a move. I just worry that the value of Kerstad or Mayo could fall in those lose-lose situations, like Mayo alluded to, where he doesn't have anything else to prove.
Yeah, at the AAA level, and it kind of relies on someone like Mountcastle having a good enough season, and that's kind of a tough range. He's got to be good enough to be worth what you're looking for on the trade block to package him with a prospect for an upgraded pitcher. But if he's so good, that may also keep the team from being willing to do the tough thing and move him. And obviously, this doesn't mean I want Mountcastle to not be very good, but I do think that that would put the Orioles in a tough position in terms of moving him. Now, it raises his value in terms of a trade, of course, but I I don't know. This organization just seems to love its bats, and I get that. No, seeing the bats that they have, but at a certain point, you need solid pitching, and that's just not something you feel super confident about this team right now. What you took Eflin, reliable veteran guy behind him. It's a lot of names who really would be 4 or 5 starters on a lot of other teams. Dean Kramer is a name we're very familiar with. I like Dean Kramer. He seems like a solid pitcher, but he's not a 2 or 3 starter for a playoff contender. I would say the same thing goes for Charlie Morton. And then but those two guys look like they're set for roster spots on opening day and spots in the rotation. Tomoyuki Sugano is probably going to make the roster as another starter in that rotation. And then number 5 is either going to be Albert Suarez or Cade Povich. And that's just not a list of 5 names that inspires a lot of confidence. Now, there's a range of outcomes with those guys. Povich had a fantastic spring. Povich has looked excellent all spring, and that's definitely something to be excited about. Just having like a good lefty starter is not something I feel like we've had much of in the last couple of years. Um, and Sugano, of course, could be really good if he brings what he is, purported to bring from Japan, which is a really good feel for the game, good mix of pitches, sequencing, control. But he's still not going to be like a shutdown starter. That's just not how he profiles. And so even on the, high end of outcomes for Sugano and Povich, you're still not seeing them replace what, you're losing in Rodriguez and Burns from last year.
Yeah, I agree because I mean Povich, like he's looked good in spring training, but it still kind of does feel like it would be one of the better outcomes if he became like a top 3 starter on our team. If he ended up separating himself from Kramer, Sugano, and Morton, like that's probably like an 80th percentile outcome. I mean, his pitch mix, like he doesn't throw hard. He didn't seem to miss a lot of bats his rookie year, and obviously he could improve. He's still young, but I just definitely don't think Povich is someone we can look to as a potential in-house answer for this problem. I think that we're going to have to go elsewhere. And something I mentioned in an article not too long ago was it would be nice to have him in the rotation. Just I think to have a lefty, right? Because you don't necessarily have to have a lefty in a rotation. Like that's not something that's mandatory or even necessarily so much better. But I think, to be honest, I mean, it's not a bad thing to keep an opposing team honest and test their depth in a three-game series, right? Like, then you got to see the other side of their platoon play. They might be weaker on the right-handed short side of the platoon. So, look, it's something I would consider exploring, especially since Suarez is, he's in his mid-30s, like fine as depth, fine as like the team's number seven starter, fine as a long reliever, but I think this is kind of a perfect time to just see what Povich can do. And if you don't like it, by then Rodriguez will be back, or maybe McDermott will be back from his injury, and just try someone else. But yeah, we're gonna have to look outside of the organization at some point if we're serious about winning it all this year.
Yeah, Suarez is to me an example of, going into the casino and hitting the slots and taking your money and running and not, pouring that money back into betting on him again. Again, I think as a spot starter, as a depth guy, he's good and he's experienced. He's definitely last year must have built a lot of confidence for him, given, his career arc and the kind of up and down of the last several years for him. I'm sure he's coming into the season with more confidence, but like you said, he's also coming in the season a year older. And it's not like he was elite last year either. He was better than expected. And that's fantastic. And it was fun to not, I think early in the season when you saw Albert Schwartz was pitching, you'd get worried. And as the season went on, you just got less and less worried. And that's a good thing to have for a 4 or 5 guy. But again, not a guy who's going to be able to separate himself as a number 2 or 3 starter in this rotation. And the reality is you can almost expect that he's going to have to probably take a spot in the rotation at some point this year with just the cycle of injuries that happen over the course of a year. Now, obviously, I don't think anyone's predicting quite the injuries that happened to this rotation last year to the point where Suarez would take up a permanent spot in the rotation. But the idea of him starting, a dozen games over the course of the season isn't really out of the realm of possibility for me. And again, it's just tough to come into the season knowing you're going to have to be looking to upgrade, and knowing that there are prospects that you have that you really like that other teams are also looking to get from you. And it leaves, I think, more uncertainty than is desired for a team like this that relies a lot on their projections and their metrics to determine their roster moves. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in how the first 2 months of the season could go. Um, with that in mind, I wanted to go through their roster and see if we could predict the opening day roster for the Orioles this year. They've been pretty consistent in what they've done numbers wise over the last couple of years. 5 pitchers, 8 relievers is pretty standard, 2 catchers, and then obviously they'll have their starting infield, and then there's the remaining 7 spots would typically be four outfielders, a couple utility guys, or 5 outfielders and a couple utility guys. This year, obviously, with the injury to Gunnar, that their opening day roster is going to hopefully not be their permanent roster over the course of the season. But I guess let's start. Let's start with pitching since we were talking about that. Since we were talking about that, those 5 that we just talked about. Do you think that's the rotation to start the year?
Yeah, to start the year, it'll be, definitely Eflin, Morton, Kramer, Sugano, and either Povich or Suarez. And the other one likely ends up in the long relief role in the bullpen. I would think especially Suarez profiles as that role. If we decide to go Suarez in the rotation over Povich, which I think after Povich's quality spring start is probably a little less likely, because then who kind of fits in as that long man? We're going to use like a fringy veteran guy, or are we going to delay Povich's development and put him as the long man in the pen? I think that all 6 of those guys are probably on the team, and I think Suarez is probably the long reliever, at least if it was up to me. But I guess, we'll see how much they believe in Suarez.
Yeah, I think that's what I do as well. I think Povich in the pen to me brings less than he would bring in the rotation. I think if you're going to have a guy who is less proven and less consistent, I would rather see what I can get out of him as a starter, and have Suarez be the long reliever out of the pen, as a guy that you trust going to early in games if you need to, who can eat some innings. So assuming either Suarez or Povich, one of those is in the pen, that means there's 7 other relievers. Now, I think obviously Felix Bautista seems to be tracking to make the opening day roster. Um, Unsure if he is going to be like in a full workload right away based on the Orioles comments. Based on their comments of I don't think that he's going to be coming out every day as the closer, at least right away. I think they're really going to let him ramp up and see. So that does mean that there's got to be almost a secondary closer or two guys that you're willing to go to other than Felix. So who would those other two guys be in the pen for you?
Well, as far as Felix goes, I definitely think they'll be hesitant to use him on back-to-backs for maybe like the entire first half. And honestly, I think that's kind of where we went wrong to begin with in 2023. I remember watching us play and watching us just, use Felix so much in those tight games, specifically on this West Coast road trip. I remember we played like Seattle in those tough games, and then we played San Diego. And I think we used him like 4 times that week. And I remember saying, a couple weeks before he ended up injuring his elbow, I was like, man, he's gonna get hurt. He's a big man with those long levers, like throwing 100 miles per hour. Those ligaments are only going to hold up so long if we don't give him ample rest. So I think we'll certainly try and make sure that he's able to go back to back in the playoffs by kind of avoiding doing that in the regular season. I think that kind of the easy answer to this question is Yennier Cano as the potential guy to step in as closer. I know that hasn't really worked out for him in the past, and we definitely prefer him in this setup role. But he's statistically been pretty undeniably the next best guy, I think, to bring in, especially since our $10 million commitment in Kittredge is already injured.
Hmm.
But the Orioles physical said that we couldn't sign Jeff Hoffman anyways. And then Sir Anthony Dominguez has had just a brutal spring. Like, dude, look at that ERA. It makes you want to vomit. So I think it's pretty hard to want to trust him either. So Cano, and then maybe if it's a lefty heavy lineup, I think I lean Gregory Soto over CNL Perez just because of the experience in the closer role. I know that Soto sometimes it's like throwing a dart blindfolded when he's pitching, but he does have great stuff. So I could see either of them being the first men up on a potential back-to-back save opportunity set of 2 games.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. The having a righty and a lefty, if you can't go to Felix every time, having a righty and a lefty you like to go to, I think just makes sense for the long-term planning. Like, Hyde's got to manage the bullpen over, stretches of games, not just individual games, and that like you just talked about, looking at every game individually and like they did with Felix can get dangerous with these pitchers. So Felix, Cano, Soto, I still think I certainly think Sir Anthony Dominguez and Cionel Perez make this roster. So sorry, I'm trying to count while doing this. Batista, Cano, Dominguez, Perez, Soto, and then either Povich or Suarez. That leaves two more spots for relievers. What I've been seeing is another season of Keegan Aiken and another season of Brian Baker. And those are Aiken I've gradually come around on. Baker, I still have not. I know he like had a really nice start to the spring, but then looked really bad. I think this weekend against, I think it was the Twins, or gave up a couple homers. To me, that's the Brian Baker experience, which is you're going to get some games where he's going to blow guys away and then he's going to completely blow others. And um, I think the Orioles already have a good amount of hit or miss in their pen, and I just don't think Baker's upside is worth his downside ultimately. So that's probably my one guy who is probably going to make the roster that I would prefer another name. I liked how Matt Bowman looked last year. I'm trying to think of some of the other depth names, depth pitchers on the roster. But even Ronci Contreras, I could see just as a younger guy, and getting him some experience. I could see them doing that too. Or I guess I might prefer them doing that too, I should say, over Baker. But I think what they ultimately do is put Baker and Aiken on the roster.
Yeah, I think Aiken is actually probably another guy who might get considered for those save chances as a left-handed pitcher. He's kind of, more controlled than Soto is. See, he had a pretty good year last year, actually. They might turn to Aiken before they turn to Soto in those left-handed save opportunities. I do think he's a little better suited in more of like a fireman role in those middle innings where he faces
Hmm.
maybe like 4 or 5 batters and 3 of them are lefties. I think that's a little more Aiken speed just because he doesn't quite have the electric closer type of stuff. But yeah, that last bullpen spot, Kittredge obviously made a lot of sense in that role, and now that he's injured, it's probably going to be Brian Baker, and I'm not too thrilled about it either. I mean, you always love the stuff seems to be good, right? He throws hard, and he's a big dude, and you always think, well, there's that one outing in four where you're like, maybe this is it. But those other three are always really tough to get through. The thing is, I don't really love Matt Bowman either because he's kind of just a soft tosser, and I almost seem to think Baker's upside might be better than Bowman's. And Contreras maybe as a possibility as a middleman. I do think also if we put Suarez in the rotation, Contreras might be the leading contender to be the long reliever if we choose to give Povich more starter type of workload in AAA. Um, but I feel like it's probably going to be Baker, and there's going to be some tough watches for a little while.
Yeah, and I think we keep coming back to it. And I think it's something we talked about at the trade deadline last year. It's something we talked about this offseason, which is there is very clearly a gap between how the rest of the MLB tends to value players and how the Orioles tend to value players. And they're not willing to overpay above what their models say a guy is worth. And that's an approach that I completely get as someone who reads Moneyball religiously. But at the same time, you do have to operate in the market that you're working in, and you do have to be willing to go above those projections when you need to. So it'll be an ongoing issue. It'll be an issue for this team. Unfortunately, it has been for a couple years, and it seems like it'll continue to be that way until either they hit on a number of prospects, I think, in the same time range, or they change their approach and they're willing to go out and give up some of these top prospects. And, look, people didn't want to give up Norby last year, and he really good for a little while. Then he settled back into being, closer to the league average player that he's expected to be. And so at a certain point, you have to kind of divorce yourself from, you know, loving these guys that you drafted and developed. So I think I ultimately agree. They go with Baker and Aiken, and that will complete the bullpen. I think the rest is a little bit easier. Catcher, I think it'll be Adley and Gary Sanchez. To me, there's really no question there. Um, Basallo is gonna have to get his opportunity sometime, but I don't think it's gonna be right after they paid $8 million to a veteran catcher. Um, so he's probably just going to go down and like Mayo, it's kind of a lose-lose. He's just going to keep raking in AAA. And if he doesn't, then there's going to be all this concern about, is he really going to be that good? And we'll go through the cycle with yet another prospect. Even like I could 100% see him coming up and struggling just like everyone else has and kicking off another wave of concern. What are your thoughts on Basallo and what his outlook is this year?
I think he's kind of in a different boat than Mayo just because Basayo is only 20 and he hasn't even really played much in AAA. Like we've already seen Kobe Mayo play an entire season in AAA with an OPS over 900. Like, and he's 23. I think he's going to be 24. He's about as major league ready as you could ask for with the bat, at least. I know the defense has kind of been what's holding him back. Like, if he was an elite defender, we'd probably find a place to put him. But as for Basayo, I think the Gary Sanchez signing for this year was almost like another one-way bridge. And I think after 2025, the goal is that in 26, Basayo is going to be the other catcher on the roster. And I think both him and Adley are going to play, and both of them are going to get time at DH as well. I know they've tried both of them at first base a little bit too, which makes the first base outlook for Mayo even a little more murky. But I think for Basayo, he's still developing. I mean, he's still barely played in AAA, and you know, while they could probably put him on the opening day roster, that might not be best practice. But as for Mayo, he's in a different boat. He has already done it for a year. So now if he goes back and doesn't hit for a mid 900s OPS, then it's like, okay, well, he's regressing now. He's not as valuable. So I think they are in a bit of different situations.
Yeah, and it's a like you said with Mayo, it's a lose-lose for the Orioles too, where if he goes down, he regresses, and you can't get as much for him in a trade. And if he does well, then everyone's screaming at you for not putting him on the roster. Basayo, I agree. I think something I've talked about a lot last year with amid Adley slump was, the value of having two catchers who can hit on your roster is actually pretty insane. Especially if one or both those guys can also take reps at first base when you need them to as well, because you can get them in the lineup as much as you possibly can. If they're both plus hitters. I think that I think. Do you think we'll see Basayo this year?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think he would really have to tear it up and kind of force his way onto the roster because we did give Gary Sanchez a major league contract. And, obviously major league teams are hesitant to just walk away from, a few $1 million they threw at a player and just kind of cut him. But I mean, I think that the opportunity is there. If he's crushing it and they think that he's ready to manage a staff behind the plate, I don't think it would be until after the All-Star break for certain, unless Adley got injured. Um, but I definitely think we would be willing to give him a shot, especially because in his case, unlike many of our other prospects, the opportunity is there for him, unlike with Mayo or even with Kerstad.
Yeah, and I think those the if the long term plan is, eventually you're going to have to sign Adley, and we won't get into this whole conversation, but ideally they're signing Adley to a long term deal, and then they won't want to pay, their second catcher nearly as much. And that's naturally where you have a guy like Basayo who's on that rookie contract to come in. Now you talked about first base, and we talked about it earlier. Mountcastle and O'Hearn, the two Ryans, are going to be the opening day first baseman, and then they're going to continue to play them based on the matchup, lefty righty typically, which I think is a good situation for both of them. O'Hearn is just such a fan favorite in the way that he came here and just not just started hitting really well, but really became a part of the culture and a part of the clubhouse. The other infield spots, I think, get a little bit more complicated because you have Westberg, I feel like, is likely at third base. But then you have to figure out second and shortstop. Do you put Holiday at shortstop and then Soto at second?
I do think that seems to be where the organization is kind of trending. Like, I think that based on spring training and Holiday's appearances at shortstop, that they view him as the next man up at shortstop. I think, people asked about Ramon Arias and people asked about, whether Jordan Westburg could play shortstop. And Arias has missed some time in spring training. I was looking it up just now because I didn't see him at all while I was there. He's been dealing with a sore hamstring, but Hyde just said they expect him to play tomorrow. So I would think he'll be included on the opening day roster. And I think with no gunner, I would expect probably Westberg at second, just because Westberg's arm is really not great. Like, I know we're playing him at third base because we don't think Holiday has a great arm either. But I would think Westberg would be at second, Holiday would be at short, and Arias would be at third if Henderson had to miss any time. That would be my guess. And then Livan Soto would kind of slide into that backup infield role because he could probably play at least up the middle and maybe, third in a pinch as well. So I think that's how they line up. And then, when Mateo forces himself back into the mix too, then you get some real big questions as to who gets bumped out for him.
Yeah, and I think at that point it's a better problem to have. Some of these problems are good problems to have, some of these backlog problems. And once Gunner's back, you can move Holiday over to second, Westbrook over to third, and you're kind of consistent. And then who knows? We'll see who's hitting better between Arias and Soto to start the season as a matter of who stays. Because I think it's certainly getting to the point where Arias is not long for this team, it feels like. And of course, there's also Mateo, who's supposed to come back, who won't be ready for opening day, but will, should be ready at some time this season. Before we get to the outfield and a couple more observations, predictions for the season, we're going to take a quick break and be right back. Okay, welcome back to Baltimore Birdwatchers. When we left off, we were talking about our opening day roster predictions and moving on to the outfield. This leaves five outfielders for the Orioles to put on the opening day roster. Colton Cowser, Cedric Mullins, Tyler O'Neill, and Heston Kjerstad, I would say, are locks for the roster. Kjerstad came up last year, struggled, but I think they're going to let him sink or swim in the majors at this point. I don't think he is maybe the least to gain of anyone by going back to AAA, given the time that he spent back there. Who is the fifth outfielder? I think is the bigger question.
I'm guessing it's going to be Ramon Laureano just because I think the financial investment for him was, I think 3 or 4 times more. I think he got a $3 or $4 million deal, whereas Carlson just got shy of $1 million, 975K, I think. So I would bank on it being Laureano. But this is where it gets murky again, because when Gunnar Henderson comes back, then that's Levon Soto or whoever other the infielder spot is. But Jorge Mateo can also play outfield. And then it gets to the point of, well, one of Mateo, Urias, or Laureano has to go unless somebody else gets injured, or at least this is a can that gets kicked down the road if somebody is injured, because you can't have all three of these guys on the team. And then, Mayo forces his way into the mix too. Now we're talking potentially two of these guys have to go. And for me personally, I think that Mateo is the one I would most want to keep. I know that the bat, we still kind of wish over the bat being better. But it's not like Arias or Laureano are tremendous hitters ever. They're maybe, marginally better, but Mateo is a plus runner and a plus defender, and you can put him anywhere. Like the value of that is just something that I think Arias and Laureano can't match. But with Mateo injured, obviously, you'll see Laureano on the team. The fact that we gave him $4 million, though, it does kind of make me think, well, maybe he's the guy that they want to keep. Maybe he's the guy they like. Because I was surprised to see that, especially after giving Dylan Carlson, a guy who, with major league experience, was just signed a week before to a cheaper deal. So I just, I'm interested to see how we handle these tough questions with these, quite honestly, pretty mediocre players.
Yeah, Mateo is a guy who I've long said is like he is the kind of utility player you see on a championship team for what you just said, the speed and the defense, the fact that you can put him in the game late in games on defense or on offense and get impact out of him fairly consistently when you do it right. To me, he's a guy that's why he's valuable. That's why they will, that's why they keep him around. I think that's why he survives a lot of the roster turnover once he's back from the injured list. All of this also comes with a caveat of, we'll see what happens when the season starts. Laureano could be great or terrible, and Carlson could be great. Who knows? But I think what you're saying really highlights they've kind of set themselves up to make these decisions, and none of them are very clear which way. Like I said earlier, for an organization that values information and modeling and projections, there's a very wide range of outcomes for where a lot of this could go. So with our roster set, we don't have to go through each spot in detail. But I was hoping we could put together a lineup for opening day. We can just assume it's a right-handed pitcher. I'm not sure who's the.
It is. It's Barrios, I believe.
There we go. So Jose Barrios opening day in Tampa Bay or in Toronto. What does that lineup look like for you? Who are you putting at leadoff?
Well, it certainly gets a little trickier if Gunnar is out. Gunner's my leadoff hitter if he's healthy. If he's out, the team has a lot more lefties than righties, but there's not really like an obvious left-hander to hit leadoff. I think, it's possible you could see Adley there just because, he's a tough out. He's a good hitter. I don't really know if Cowser kind of profiles as your typical leadoff hitter because he strikes out as much as he does, but I also don't think you can hit Cedric Mullins there either because I don't think he's that good. So I think it's very possible that it's either Adley Rutschman or Jordan Westburg if Gunnar Henderson's out. But again, we don't know that Gunnar is going to be out. So I guess I'll just say Gunnar.
Yeah, I mean, Gunner's clearly a leadoff guy. If he's healthy, I think I'd be between Cowser and Westberg for leadoff. I, part of it is I really like House's approach. I like him as a leadoff hitter. I really like what we saw out of him last year. Still think he was robbed for rookie of the year. And then I think Adley and Westberg, I think would round out the top, would round out the first three. Fourth in Toronto, I don't think there's any question who's going to be hitting fourth in Toronto. It should be Ryan Mountcastle. I mean, he owns that stadium. He owns that team, that city even. I could see them maybe putting Tyler O'Neill fourth and Mountcastle fifth, but that's, I think, what I would see them doing.
So when I was building my lineup, the trouble I had was after I had Gunnar hitting leadoff and I had Adley hitting two. I think the financial commitment with Tyler O'Neill, we gave him $16.5 million this year, and he hit 31 home runs in like 110 games. I think he's probably going to be the guy who hits third in this lineup. Because, I think that as far as, management goes and that sort of thing, they want to put the guys out there that they're paying a lot of money to in the middle of the order. I mean, I'm sure that was maybe a promise made to him. Hey, we'll bat you in the middle of the order. So I think my problem kind of came with what I do with the rest of the righties in this lineup because I put Cowser fourth because I do think his approach is a little bit more of a middle of the order guy than a leadoff guy. At least right now, he certainly could make adjustments. It was only his first season last year. If he cuts down on his strikeouts, he has great potential and he could be a top of the order type of guy. And then I was really between 5 and 7, Westburg and Mountcastle. And I think if you had put this series anywhere else but at the Rogers Center, I would have put Westburg fifth. But it is pretty hard
100%.
to deny that Mountcastle's been phenomenal in Toronto against the Blue Jays. So I put Mountcastle fifth, and then I put O'Hearn sixth and Westburg seventh, which I don't
Yeah,
like, by the way. I mean, I feel bad because I love Westburg, and having him hit seventh feels like malpractice.
yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be a case where Henderson being out is going to give him more opportunities closer to the top of the lineup, and then I think by the time Henderson comes back, although I don't think Henderson's going to be out for that long, so I don't know if we're going to get any meaningful, data out of the games that he misses to figure out how to make adjustments in the lineup. So it could just be a case where Westberg gets his opportunities early on, and then when Henderson comes back, he naturally goes down. So that's through seven. At 8 and 9, I'm assuming you've got Holiday and whoever the third outfielder is.
Mullins. Yeah, I did have Mullins in there. I do think that we'll play him on opening day just for defensive reasons and also kind of legacy reasons too. I feel like Cedric Mullins is the third outfielder on the team, and Heston Kjerstad is pretty clearly the fourth. I mean, I would assume that's not to say I necessarily see them as that far apart, but I would imagine the organization views Mullins as the kind of guy they would. I don't want to say rather see succeed, but they do like his defense a lot more. So I think that he's going to get the nod early, but I'm a little worried about the bat, especially how it ended last year. And I think, the opportunity is going to be there for Kjerstad to prove himself. And I do think if he's a significantly better hitter a couple months into the season, that they're going to slide Cowser over to center and they'll have some shaky defense on the corners. But if the bat's producing at the rate where you can't deny it over Mullins, Mullins could slide back into that fourth outfielder spot. But I think on opening day, I had Mullins eighth, Holiday ninth. Um, a lot of speed at the bottom. It'll be three lefties in a row if Gunner's hitting leadoff. But like I said, there's a lot of lefties on this team, so you're going to have an area of your order where there's a lot of lefties in a row, probably.
Yep, Zach Eflin slated to take the bump. I think that's obviously became the obvious choice after Gunner went down. It's nothing to be super excited about, but it is certainly not as exciting as Corbin opening last year. But if you look back a couple more years, it's certainly a little more stability than we've had on opening day in the past years. Last segment I wanted to do was your general prediction for how the seasons go. I think we'll probably come back with another episode around opening day with some more concrete look at the whole season. But in general, how do you think the seasons go? Do you think this team makes the playoffs, wins the division?
I definitely think this team makes the playoffs. I feel very confident in the offense and the offensive depth. I mean, even if our starters get injured, like we got quality guys to step in and take ABs. We got Kjerstad who can come off the bench and hit. I mean, Kobe Mayo is just a call away if we have an injury on the corners. And then in the middle infield, we could end up sliding Westberg to second and then bring up Kobe Mayo to play third base in the event of an injury up the middle. So I think that the offense is, it's going to carry us through the season with all these middle of the road starters. So I think playoffs, I feel very confident about. I feel a little more confident about the division now with Garrett Cole getting Tommy John surgery. And also I really, really like Garrett Crochet's talent, but I struggle to trust him to, handle a legit aces workload. Like I don't think he's going to be out there throwing Zach Wheeler type of workloads. I think that they're going to have to kind of still manage him a little bit if they want him to be healthy for a long time. I mean, that's what I would do if Garrett Crochet was on my team. I'd kind of be reluctant to put him out there for the sixth inning when it gets to August and July and it's the middle of the season, just because of very, noted injury history. Look, it's going to be a tough road, but I think if we acquire a good starter at the deadline, we should be able to win the division. But that's a big if. And if we
And
don't, we might not.
that's exactly where I was going to go with my prediction, which is I think this team absolutely has the talent to make the playoffs. I was just looking at the total win odds and they're at over under 87.5, which just strikes me as low. And that's to me a number I would definitely see the Orioles clearing. But yeah, I think the pitching as it is, even assuming a return from Grayson, and a solid year for him, I'm still not sure I'm confident about with them winning the division, though I certainly think they make the playoffs. Last question before we hop off here, Daniel. What's one thing this season that you'd put your stake in the ground for, that you'd say this player is going to do well or struggle, or this thing is going to happen? What's something that you'll put your stake in the ground for?
The only thing that I could think of and really say I'm confident this is going to happen is I don't think that Kerstad, Mayo, or Basayo will get traded. I just feel like that's how the organization has handled its assets, and I think we would find a different way to get creative to trade for a pitcher, kind of like we did with Eflin, where we ended up trading Mac Horvath and Jackson Ballmeister, who, by the way, is a relatively intriguing pitching prospect. I think that we'd rather, especially since we're building up kind of the Dominican side of the organization, we'd rather organizations kind of take those big ticket potential item. Maybe a guy like Zach Fruit is a guy who gets moved for a big pitcher. I think we would rather move them. Like I'm trying to think of like a Honeycutt or an O'Farrell or somebody than those guys who are right at the major league level. And I think that might prevent us from getting the highest echelon starter at the end of the day. And I think it's fair to ask at the end of the season, if this team doesn't make a big run, like, are we doing something wrong by not trading our best prospects? But I just would be surprised at this point if it happens. Honestly, our top of the organization, young guys, I think will stay in orange and black all season.
I think I agree with you on that. I think I agree with you on that, just given the way this team tends to operate around the deadline and the value they look for. I think the thing I'll put my stake in the ground on is that I think Tomoyuki Sugano is going to have a really, really good debut year. I think he's going to be in contention to be one of the oldest rookies of the years of all time, with a really solid season. I think he finished the season as the Orioles' third best starter, second best if Grayson doesn't come all the way back and be the guy that he's expected to be. I think that his approach, I think it might take him a little while to like start missing a ton of bats and really start deceiving guys until he settles in. But I think his control focused approach, I think, is something I felt like this team has been missing in the rotation. I feel like we've had guys who don't throw super hard in the rotation, but they're not technicians the way that Sugano is. And I think that approach is going to translate really well, especially, with a guy like Adley behind the plate, who's just been very good at calling games over even this early in his career. So he's a guy I'm really excited to see. I'm really excited to see him start at Camden Yards this year. So any last thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want you to expand on that, man. Can you give me what a really good season for Sugano looks like? What are those numbers?
So I don't know if I could say statistically what a really good season for him looks like, because I'm not super familiar with his stats from Japan. I could see him finishing with a sub 4 ERA. I know wins. I'm trying. I know wins aren't a pitcher stat, but I could see him walk. I could see him finishing with a sub 4 ERA. And a really good strikeout to walk ratio. He's not a guy he doesn't walk a lot of guys. And I think he might be a little bit cautious early on and really challenging hitters. But I think as the season goes on and his confidence grows a little bit, I think he'll start getting more Ks as the season goes on, as he starts to get a better feel for how to kind of set up. And I think it's fair to say that major league batters are probably going to be a little bit more aggressive than the approach in Japan. Again, this is based on my limited knowledge of Japanese baseball, but I think that once he figures out how to exploit that aggression, I think he'll have a really good year.
He's clearly a very cerebral pitcher. If you look at his history, he's tremendously low ERAs with tremendously low strikeout totals. So it's obvious he's always trying to adjust back. to what opponents know about him. And I also think that your claim about him being, the third best guy in the rotation is certainly possible because that's not a very high bar to eclipse.
No.
But I have honestly a lot of questions, dude. Like he's 36, he's never thrown a lot of innings in his career. Um, like I don't he just doesn't strike out a lot of batters. Like you mentioned him having a really good strikeout to walk ratio. Like he'll have a good walk ratio. Like I don't know if at the end of the day he strikes out enough batters to have a good strikeout to walk ratio. And then you get to the major leagues and you're not striking a lot of guys out. And there's just not a lot of pitchers who succeed at the major league level with like at a an above average level without striking a lot of guys out. So I do think that he will, kind of provide similar value to Charlie Morton. But at his age, I mean, look, he's 36. Like he is what he is. There's no more like jumps to be taken physically. Like he's just gonna have to mentally outwill hitters to succeed, basically. And also he's gotta last the whole season. And I have questions about both of those things, to be honest.
Yeah, the injury side of things, I don't, to me, there's a level of I don't want to say randomness with that, but unpredictability with that. I think the thing I'm really more interested in with Shigano is um how how good he was in Japan, um, even at the age of 35 last year. To me, is a very clear sign that, these are things that translate. These are things that he's going to be able to carry over into this year. I don't think there's a super high upside outcome to his season. Like you said, I think there's a pretty firm ceiling on what he can do, but I actually think he'll get pretty close to what that ceiling is. Um, I don't I don't know if there's anything specific I can really pin on like statistically why I'm so hopeful. I just think it's a matter of having a pitcher who has a really nice pitch mix and a really good understanding of sequencing and tunneling to deceive hitters. And because he's the kind of guy who's constantly working on his arsenal and on his approach, I think he's going to be able to gain steam throughout the season. I think he'll start okay. He'll be very cautious. He won't give up a lot of walks, but I think as he gains confidence over the course of the season, he'll be a little bit more willing to try and make guys miss instead of just pitch around the edges. Again, that's I think more of a bolder take. It's why I wanted something to put a stake in the ground. I'm very curious to see how he does. But he's the kind of pitcher I really like. It's a bit more of a throwback style of pitcher that I really like, and so I'm excited to see what he does this year.
And look, I'll meet you in the middle because the NPB is no joke, man. That is the second best baseball league in the world. And he has long-standing success. So I am more excited about the signing of him than Charlie Morton. Um,
That's I
so
think
so
that's
I'm
where I
willing
come
to meet you
from.
in the middle there and say that it seems very possible because look, Morton's 42. I know he's thrown a lot of innings in the past, but it's hard to really expect him to throw a lot of innings, even if he has done it recently. So and Kramer, like dude, it doesn't take a lot to be better than Dean Kramer, honestly. Like he's not awful, but he's not great.
No,
So
and I think that's
I'm
why,
relatively excited
I
too
don't
to
think
see.
I don't think I'd ever say he's going to emerge as a frontline starter, but I do think he's going to establish himself as the clear, consistent number three. And if Grayson doesn't come back, potentially the number two, which is, obviously not a very good place for the Orioles to be in. But I think he'll just have a solid season. And again, I don't know how long that lasts, right? The age is such a serious concern. But at the same time, I think he'll be able to figure out enough to get himself through a solid season.
I hope so.
All right, Daniel. Well, thanks so much for joining me as always. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. We're excited to bring this podcast back for the season. Hopefully it'll be a good one.